Hello, and welcome to today's webinar with BlueSnap, focused on success with payments for subscription commerce. My name is Vanessa Collins, Field Marketing Manager for AppDirect, and I'm joined today by Ty Nam, SVP of Customer Success at AppDirect, and Ralph Dangelmaier, CEO of BlueSnap. For context, BlueSnap is used by several AppDirect customers and is pre-integrated with the platform, which equals the fastest time to market to light up online payments. Today's webinar will be a conversation to get Ralph's perspective on key topics in payments and subscription commerce, which could be relevant to you, especially if you're thinking of scaling globally, you have questions about how security is evolving in the payment sphere or unclear about compliance, or you're about to start selling physical products. Before we address all of this today, I want to share a couple of housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded, and if you have any questions, please submit them through the chat feature. We'll get through as many questions as we can at the conclusion of the presentation. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started with introductions. Ty, take it away.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks to everyone for joining us. This is Ty. I'm responsible for the customer success organization at AppDirect, which is comprised of our customer success managers, our DTS organization, and our technical support. Now, I'm really excited to have Ralph, the CEO of BlueSnap, with us for this webinar. And Ralph and BlueSnap is one of our key partners in the payment space. So welcome, Ralph.
Thanks, Ty. Nice to be here. Really excited that we can participate in your webinar.
Great. Let's get started.
Great. So I'm Ralph Dangelmaier, the CEO of BlueSnap, as you mentioned, and we're a integrated global payments partner of AppDirect. And so it's great to answer questions that you guys have from your webinar.
Great. Thanks, Ralph. Let's see, most of our customers start to engage with us as they start to think about digital transformation, and specifically, they think about how to sell digital recurring services. That's their biggest, kind of shift as they engage with AppDirect and start working with us at our marketplaces. So in that perspective, what's the major shift as someone goes from selling, one-time goods to a subscription commerce? And what are some of the things that the organization really needs to understand when they think about payments?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think a lot of people just think it's a very similar experience, which it should be on the checkout, right? Because you're charging a card once, but there's a lot of things to consider when you're going to start charging cards on a recurring basis. So first of all, obviously, there's a lot of regulation and compliance that Visa, MasterCard require now when charging the card, notifying the customers, making sure it's easy for them to change plans or subscriptions. A lot of people aren't aware of those when we set them up on these payment plans. The other thing that sometimes frustrates shoppers and merchants is when cards fail, what do? A lot of people just keep hitting the card multiple times during the day, and there's regulations and rules about how many times you can do that. And they don't tend to use what I would call backup banks to run the transactions through. So that's another important piece of moving from one time to a subscription. Also, generally speaking, the fraud rules get relaxed after a one-time purchase versus a recurring purchase. Even in Europe, there's regulations saying that you can relax some of the compliance and regulations on recurring subscriptions. So that's another thing that gets taken into consideration. So really, there's a whole strategy around what we call dunning management or recurring billing management on the payment side that just a lot of folks don't really understand when they're moving from physical one-time or digital one-time payment to a recurring payment. And so it's something that needs to be understood. I think one of the most common things that people don't realize as well is after a period of time, most people's credit cards change or get compromised. And there's a lot of tools that are available now to actually update the card, called the card updater, account updater for the Visa, MasterCards, and the American Express cards, so that you don't have to chase down those merchants every time saying, please update your card on file with us. So, so there are quite a few strategies. It's just a matter of prioritizing them and organizing and make sure what both fits best for you as you migrate from one time to a subscription on payments, Ty.
Ralph, that's a really good perspective. When it comes to recurring payments, what are you seeing as some of the trends as you look at some of the alternative payment methods that you're seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's about 100 alternative payment methods out there. And there's about 100 currencies that are being used. So people get really confused quickly where, especially when you're selling cross-border, between using sort of a foreign currency to help a purchase get through on a card and an alternative payment. And the alternative payment is kind of like, the way I think of it is each country has its own PayPal, right? And so they use these different currency, these different payment types like a SOFORT or Ideal to make payments. Now, some of these payment types are what we would call a bank transfer. And you actually have to sort of log into your account and initiate the payment like a Venmo. And you can't run a subscription on those, right? Because the consumer has to initiate the payment. And a lot of people don't realize that. And then there are recurring payments that can happen by setting up a recurring payment like ACH United States or like SEPA in Europe. So making sure that you're sort of consulting with your payment provider or that you understand what you're trying to do as it relates to sort of foreign currencies, the hundreds of different payment types, and the way you implement that for subscriptions kind of gets complicated and needs to be, again, thought out.
So I think that's probably the big takeaway for our audience. There's a nuance on these alternative payments for recurring services, and it could differ by each country.
That's correct.
Great. Well, we also have customers that have been with us for a while that's been selling digital recurring services, but now are actually selling physical goods. So as they think about selling physical goods in this manner, what are some of the things that they need to think about differently?
Yeah, so there's some obvious ones, obviously, like taxes could be very different. Obviously, the shipping costs could be very different. Fraud is very different with digital and physical. I mean, digital, usually you can just turn off the service. On fraud, on physical, after you've shipped the sneakers, it's pretty hard to get them back. Really difficult process with refunds and chargebacks and returning goods. So those are sort of ones I think probably everyone sort of thinks about. But on a payment side, the differences may not be as obvious. So for example, on a digital good, generally speaking, you're buying the product immediately, right? When you go to Netflix or Shopify, you consume the good. On a physical one, you may have to wait 10, 20, 30 days. So Visa, MasterCard put in regulation that said you have to separate what we call the authorization of the card versus the actual settlement of the funds. It happens simultaneously in the digital world. In the physical world, it has to be separated because they don't want to have too long of a period between when you actually authorize the card and take the funds. So there's a lot of rules that people don't realize when they're building out their payments provider. So that's a big one. Also, I would say in the digital world, people are much more comfortable using foreign currencies and using what we call cross-border commerce and alternative payment types. And so you tend to see people more apt to use those on the digital side than the physical side. So again, it's like trying to understand where your shoppers are, what the behaviors are, and making sure that you have a strategy on these things that you're asking, Ty, because all these things you're asking have these little nuances. And all you need to do is miss on 2 or 3 of these things, and you've created a pretty complex or difficult checkout experience for your shopper, or you're out of compliance in a country or with the card schemes, which causes a whole bunch of cleanup work. So stitching this together with a little bit of strategy is an important part of what someone needs to think about.
So maybe as you think about the complexity of someone selling a bundle, which has both digital goods and a physical good, let's say an IoT solution for tracking assets or elements like that, you really need to think through both elements, right, Ralph?
You do, and we find that's amazing that we work with some of the greatest brands in the world, and they have some of these really thought through their websites and their product marketing and the way that their store is configured. And then they get to checkout and there's not a lot of strategy put behind it. They just, oh, just hit the card and move on. And I think that we're trying to get behind that there is much more of a thoughtful plan, and you should plan your checkout process, digital, physical, global, domestic, with the same sort of criteria that you're planning out your website and your shopping experience with your shoppers. And so I think there's just more to learn and more for people to understand. And I know that's one of the reasons why you have these kind of webinars, is to help educate people on these kind of tricks to really get the highest authorization rate, stay in compliance, and have the lowest amount of fraud and the best customer experience. Easier said than done, but it is something that people need to pay much more attention to than they do today.
Yeah, it's trying to make that complex simple for their end customers. That's so important, right? But when you have a physical good, when you have a digital good, the combination, the permutation is what gets really complex.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, speaking of complexity, I think one of the areas that BlueSnap's been really a thought leader on is how to sell globally, right? And all the nuances that goes with selling goods globally across multiple marketplaces, across multiple currency.
Yeah, wow. I mean, there's a laundry list here of things to think about. I think, not to pick on the United States, but maybe I will for a second, is that everyone tends to be very US centric, single currency, a couple of cards, check out and go. Obviously, that's not how it works in the rest of the world. We've trained the rest of the world for 70 years that localization matters, right? You're going to use your favorite card type and your favorite currency, and you're going to be able to shop like that. So localization of the currency, localization of the payment type, is really, really an important step on selling cross-border. And also our data shows that when you use local currencies, so you're basically, what that means is the shopper's credit card matches the currency that you're allowing them to buy in, and we call that a currency match versus a currency mismatch. We've seen a 12% increase in authorization rates globally. So really simple, if you're a $100 million company and you don't use local currencies, you could be leaving 12% of your sales on the table. And that's after the person puts it in the checkout and wants to buy. So there's some very strong economics that show that's an important piece. A lot of countries now require this thing called 3D secure for luxury items, particularly like, you're buying watches or tickets to the World Cup. It's a text or some kind of notification that comes back to your phone, you key it in. I think we're all getting more comfortable with that in the world today, but what it does is it reduces the cost of the transaction and it reduces fraud. And it's mandatory, and that's called PSD2. It's a mandatory in Europe now, and I think that's going to become something that's going to be mandatory around the world, just like chip and pin. We all got used to dipping our cards now versus swiping. I'd say another thing people don't understand globally is privacy rules. There was some definitely GDPR came out, and that said we're going to protect consumers' data. California's adopted that. A lot of other countries adopted that. And without knowing it, you could be breaking privacy rules all around the world. And that's not a place you want to pick a fight with. And the same goes true with things like PCI compliance and taxes, not well understood globally. So getting good, strong partners in payments and taxes to make sure you're compliant just prevents a lot of problems going forward. So it's tricky to manage this for every geo. So it's, again, really important that you sort of pick your go-to-markets and you understand how you're going to deploy these things. And what I like to say is when you're selling globally, even though you've thought your product out and you've thought out the integration with your platform, Ty, you may have not thought the payments out, and it's got to be a big consideration as you're rolling these things out. So those are some of the trouble spots that we see clients get into, and you just got to do your research and make your plan.
Yeah, maybe any lessons learned from from some of your customers around a particular country that's been challenging that maybe it wasn't as expected.
Yeah. So I would say Europe right now is really tricky. They've put in GDPR privacy. They've got stronger PCI rules. They've got the PC. They've got the compliance acts that have just hit. They really want things in their currency. They've put in the 3D secure. So I would say almost every United States merchant goes to Europe trips one of those rules very quickly, and we've got to kind of help them through that. I think the other thing that people miss all the time is taxes. They figure, oh, well, here's how I do tax in the US. I just got to pay that tax in Europe and I'm done. They don't realize that there's country, state, or their products may be taxed differently. No one bothers to look up those SKUs and figure out what the taxes are. And then you got to maintain this. These things change on you every year. And so the maintaining of them is pretty tricky. So someone's got to become responsible for it afterwards. So I think the other big lesson we've learned is once you set the payment, it's not a set and forget. You got to maintain the product. You got to plan on it, release once or twice a year to maintain anything that changes in payments around the world. I think the second area that we've seen people struggle with is Latin America. In Latin America, we tend to forget that there's a lot of we call locally issued cards, which only work in country. We don't think of that in the United States, that our Visa card works, it's everywhere you want to be, right? Well, in countries like Argentina, you may get issued a card that only works in Argentina. And so the only way you're going to get that card processed, you have to go to a local bank. And you may be marketing to a whole bunch of people who have local cards who can't process them back in the United States because it has to stay in a local bank. And trying to explain all that to people gets very tricky. That's a longer explanation. And then where they usually also get very confused is when to pay and not pay the local taxes, because some of the tax rates on these countries can be 20, 25% taxes that the merchant has to pay for selling its goods and services. And then I don't want to get too complicated, but then you add FX into this. And I've seen a lot of merchants say, just forget it, even though they could have a great opportunity to sell their products in Latin America. So right now, those two areas seem pretty tricky. And there's a lot of opportunity to buy online, especially during COVID. And merchants just need to sort of have a methodical plan to work through how to capture that opportunity with their shoppers.
Yeah, Ralph, that's good lessons learned. Almost all our customers are selling in multiple countries and regions. So this is really important to know that we have that kind of expertise with our partners on selling globally. Great. Speaking of an area that's a hot topic across our customers is security. As I think, from an AppDirect perspective, we're evolving from kind of an enterprise software company to an e-commerce platform. And more and more, our customers are asking us, on some of the security issues and what's happening and preventing fraud in their marketplace. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this topic of payment security.
Oh, it's the biggest topic around with all the breaches going on, and with less people being in stores. The criminals haven't gone away, right? They don't get a holiday or a vacation, as far as I'm concerned. So there's been way more fraud. I think I just read that the fraud in online sales is up about 80% because of COVID, and so it's just become rampant. And once they get your data, there's a lot of things they can do with that. Not only, buy and ship things online, but also create, fake cards, create fake identity, and really create havoc for you. So security is super important all over the place, and privacy. And I got to tell you, I'm not this big guy for over compliance, but this GDPR Act that the UK and Europe, EU put in place about protecting privacy, is not a bad idea. And so, so what are some of the ways you can do that? Well, the way that we've done our integration together, BlueSnap and AppDirect uses something called tokenization, which means we scramble the data in an encrypted format. And if somebody were ever to hack a transaction, which has never happened between us, they would not be able to use information. And I think that is critical. I think the second part of this is making sure you don't store the information anywhere in your company. There's this big thinking that the merchants need to store all this company data, all this personal data. Well, if you do that, you better have really top-notch security, because if you look at all the breaches that happen at Home Depot and Bed and Bath and all these big retailers, they weren't really protecting the data well. And so getting with a payment provider or getting with a good e-commerce platform that really has highly skilled security people that know how to protect data and how to store the data in a tokenized or secured way, I think is a huge benefit that maybe people overlook when they're picking a solution or provider out in the marketplace. So you touched on a hot point there, Ty, and I think it's just going to get more difficult as time goes on.
Yeah, and Ralph, when there is a payment security issue, a fraud issue, how does the liability of that kind of get decided upon? It's an area I think as we work with our customers, when something does happen, is it the merchants, is it us, is it the payment processor? How when something does go bad, where does this how does this merry-go-round end?
Yeah, well, it is a merry-go-round, and it is complicated. So all of these are situational based. So most of the time, the merchant's responsible and liable for the situation. That's how it works. If the merchant has deployed some of these new rules and regulation, like 3D Secure, or using something like in a store, the chip and pin, the liability is removed from the merchant and put back on the issuer. So that's a big deal, right? So in that case, the issuer is responsible, the issuer of the card is responsible for the liability, not the merchant. And then if it's a data breach, let's say at a third party that's storing information, then they're responsible for the liability. So this is a big topic in payments. They call it liability shift. And it is a little bit like a loose football, but it's really clear to understand. And back to this whole planning and the 3D Secure and all these things we talked about earlier in some detail, making sure you understand who is responsible for liability and how you're implementing things is really important. If somebody doesn't use tokenization and use clear text cards, clearly that merchant's responsible if the card gets stolen. So it is good to know that. And I would say, Ty, to your question, if you asked 90% of the merchants who's liable in a certain situation, they probably couldn't answer that question. So it is something that probably needs a little more focus and attention and maybe more information to the merchants.
Yeah, so Ralph, we really appreciate your thought leadership on all these questions. I think these are all really important topics for our customers. But why don't I pause here and let you kind of give you maybe a little more deeper overview of what BlueSnap does.
Sure. Well, obviously, we're well integrated to your platform, and we've had a lot of success with a bunch of clients. But this is our platform overall. So this is integrated heavily into what we offer together. And so what's great about this for the merchant, if you go right in the blue middle, is we handle all of actually you've done the integration into our platform, so they don't have to do any coding. It's really pure integrated payments. They just set up a merchant account with us through an application, and we do all the underwriting, and we do all the reviews, and we do all the payout. And then we board them at 12 o'clock, sort of on the wheel here that I have, to a bank that's what most appropriate for their business type, digital, physical, both. And then what we do is we try to make sure we're aware of where they optimize the authorization, so the highest sales, where we minimize the cost based on what their transactions are. We go to make sure we have all the shopper currencies in there. We make sure we integrate the payment types where they need the payment types integrated, and that includes using things like wallet. Just in the last 6 months, we've seen a 70% increase in the use of wallets with our clients, which I think is astonishing. I think it would have taken 5 years to do that. What's happened in 7 months, and of course, it's I think called the COVID effect. If somebody's generating invoicing, we help them automate the invoice from a B2B and integrate the payment in the invoice and send it out. I think something that is really not talked about a lot as I go around this sort of wheel at 7 o'clock is how do you deal with fraud and chargeback management and alerts and all these sort of refunds and everything that goes on that a lot of people don't want to talk about in payments, but it really chews up a lot of staff and could be very, very costly. we've integrated in solutions for taxes and compliance and 3D Secure, so the merchant doesn't have to do any of that work or worry about it at all. We turn it on and we turn it off based on the country for the merchant. And at the end, all this data is in a place where they can look at it in a way to do reconciliation of their payments, in a way to understand where their highest auth rates are, to understand where their opportunities are, maybe in places like Latin America or Europe, as we talked about, and just make sure that this thing is an ever evolving, it's really a platform. So by integrating your platform with what we're doing, we give the merchant, we think, the best of both worlds, where they can have an integrated experience and really come out to market with a product that we think is better than something that, you know, a Shopify would offer that merchant. So it's a strong offering.
Great, Ralph. Thanks for the overview. I think, well, thanks again for everyone attending the webinar. I think we have a little time for a few questions. Vanessa?
We do. Thank you, gentlemen, for the great discussion today. We're going to go ahead and take some questions that were submitted from the audience. Ty, the first question is for you. When thinking about being pre-integrated with the platform, what's actually involved in getting it activated?
Yeah, I think Ralph touched on it, but it's really easy. And that's why we're so excited to have BlueSnap pre-integrated. It just means that you just plug in your BlueSnap merchant credential, and then it's really just 1 or 2 boxes you complete, and you're ready to go to take credit cards or debit cards from BlueSnap to process.
That's right.
Perfect. Thanks. And Ralph, we'll go ahead and ask a question to you. For someone who is selling online for the first time, is a redirected checkout the first step or an embedded checkout better from a user experience perspective?
Well, an embedded checkout is a lot easier for the merchant. It looks much more like an Amazon or Uber kind of experience for them. So, and obviously that's what we built together. So that's the ideal, most frictionless process for the shopper.
All right. And we'll go ahead and take one more question. And Ralph, this one's going to be for you as well. I've heard the term split settlements. What is this? And what are some things to watch out for?
Yeah, split settlement. So a lot of people refer to split settlement within what we call a marketplace. So I call this the Amazon effect. So obviously what Amazon is a giant marketplace with a lot of merchants underneath, and you can buy and sell goods from this giant mall. Well, now what's going on is there's lots of brands in the company, whether it's skiing or selling cars or selling, you know, they're retailers, and they want to sell other people's products under their brand. So maybe you're at Ford, or maybe you're at Arrangements, or maybe you're at Roswell Skis, and you want to buy other products. What happens is in the Amazon world is the merchant selling the merchandise online gives their cut to Amazon, and then the cut goes to the merchant. So if it's a $100 item, $20 may go to Amazon, $80 goes to Titleist. Well, now the other merchants can use their brand to split the settlement or split the payment based on the rules that's been negotiated on that brand selling those other products. And it's really the only way to really start competing with Amazon, because you have to assume if you're a brand, you may not sell everything online a consumer wants, and you want to sell some other products. And if you can start doing that, and you can split the settlement, you can add and sell products just like Amazon does all day long. And this is a big trend that's running around the world to really compete with Amazon.
Awesome. Well, glad we covered that question. That is going to be the last question for today's Q&A session. If we were unable to answer the question you submitted, don't worry. Someone from AppDirect or BlueSnap will be following up directly via email. Thank you, gentlemen, again for your time today. Ty and Ralph, it was a great conversation. And thank you to everyone who has attended. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Cheers.
Thank you.